Today is Wednesday, December 18th, 2024, and this is episode 289 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat. And by the way, the reason he's laughing is because that was my fourth time trying to get the date right.
You know, it sucks getting old, and when you're unemployed, what day do days even matter? Are they even real?
Time has no meaning anymore. That's right.
Good afternoon, good evening, Jerry. How are you, my good sir?
I'm awesome. How are you doing? How are you doing?
I'm good. I tell you, we've been doing a lot of getting defensive, which is great. And we have interviews, which is wonderful. And if you haven't checked it out, check it out, by the way, shameless plug. And so we've been doing all these interviews. It's kind of cool, just you and I again, but it's weird. I've been used to a third person that we got to entertain and ask useful questions of. Now I just have to sit here and be snarky. So it's a little easier.
We don't have anybody else to carry us, I think is what you're trying to say.
Kind of, a little bit. And I worked in a shameless plug for getting defensive.
That's true, which is at gettingdefensive.com. And also, if you're on our YouTube channel, it is one of the playlists there.
It's true.
And one more shameless plug. I'm now doing a thing called DefSec Today, which I think is partly serious but mostly not serious.
You're getting all cool with the kids today with these shorts, I'm told they're called.
That's
little
right.
Snippets of factual yet funny information.
That's very true.
It's popular with the youngins, I'm told.
Absolutely.
So yeah, they're cool. I didn't know you had it in you. I'm impressed.
So the next iteration of our podcast, I think, is going to be us on screen, but then in the middle, it'll be one of those Minecraft playthroughs, which is also super popular with the kids these days.
You know, I'm in. Let's do it.
Right. So one more thing. I do want to make a call out to our Patreon donors. Thank you very much.
Good call.
And by the way, if you do want to support the podcast and our endeavors to create content, you can do so at patreon.com/defensivesec. And we certainly appreciate you.
Yeah, you guys are awesome. It's helping to pay the bills. It's surprising when you kind of get some audience how expensive some of this stuff can be. Not that we don't mind, and we like doing it. This show has always been ad-free. We're hoping to keep it that way. We have some other shows like Getting Defensive that may eventually have ads to help cover costs. But in the meantime, Patreon helps. And we are thinking about working up some kind of unique benefits for our Patreon donors. So keep an eye out for that.
And not those kind of benefits. Keep it clean. Yes. No, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to them.
Nothing's off the table.
All right, fair enough. You're going to try to give away my feet pics, aren't you?
Look, hosting bills are not cheap.
That's very true. All right. The other thing I wanted to say is that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers.
Only one of us is currently employed, but sure.
I mean, at some point I might have another one and somebody might go back and look at this and say, oh my God, I can't believe he represents, I don't know, the White House. Who knows? Who knows, right?
Wow. Shooting big, but yes. Fair enough.
Go big or go home. All right. So we do have a couple of stories for today. The first one comes from Ars Technica, and the title here is Year-Long Supply Chain Attack Targeting Security Pros Steals 390,000 Credentials. Wow.
That's non-trivial.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a fascinating story. The deal here is that some baddies have created, I guess what I'll call malicious GitHub repositories that contain legitimate looking code that is intended to, or at least it purports to validate whether or not WordPress login credentials are accurate. And in fact, it actually does that. And so what the adversary here has done is create this. I think there are multiple GitHub repositories containing different types of tools, and it attracts both other bad guys and red team type people who are looking to assess whether or not the credentials that they've collected are in fact valid. But the thing that happens, which the people using these tools don't understand, is it's also exfiltrating a copy of those credentials to the bad actors that created the repository. And apparently this was going on for the better part of a year, which is how they ended up with 390,000 credentials. It wasn't all in one go. It was, a slow burn over the course of a year.
Yeah, that's wild. They say if the product is free, you're the product. So in this case, you're eating a service. You were just paying for it in a way you didn't understand.
It's a good way to look at it. I like your perspective. Yes, it's good.
Hey, look, people got to eat, as we were just saying earlier.
That's right. So by the way, it's not unprecedented for either bad actors to try to con other bad actors in this way. And it's also not unprecedented for bad actors to try to trick, the good guys. And so I think, this is an interesting play on both of those scenarios. But I think it's a really good reminder that, not everything you find on GitHub is legitimate or good. And just because you're a quote security researcher doesn't mean that you are above the fray and untouchable. So, perhaps you ought to, do a little more due diligence in inspecting what you're using. This certainly could have been a different set of facts where, that you were running malware on your computer that you were thinking was some sort of an exploit proof of concept, which we've seen in the past, right? That's happened in the not so distant past where some enterprising bad guy creates what looks like what purports to be a proof of concept for some newly released critical vulnerability, and all of the good guys out there are trying to figure out like how this vulnerability works, and so there's a mad dash to go look for proof of concept code, and then it tends to attract the corporate type and security research type people who are quite willing to run that stuff and can get themselves into trouble.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like this one, I think one of these was hosted in NPM's JavaScript repository. And I'm wondering, we keep seeing this as an attack vector both for GitHub and PyPy, and this case it's the NPM repository, which it's not those companies or those entities' fault that people are using this to post malicious activity. But I'm wondering at some point if they're going to have to do something to actually have like safe, verified, checked repositories versus like experimental or wild, wild west repositories, and some level of assurance, because I think they're going to get so much reputation damage that could hurt their core business if they're not careful.
I think so. I mean, certainly those have been in the news a lot lately. NPM and PyPy and others. I think the challenge is, for anybody, especially who's worked with NPM or JavaScript, the average application pulls in like thousands of these libraries. So yeah. I don't know exactly. And I'm sure I could probably go easily figure it out, and I didn't do it because that's how I roll. I've got to believe there's like millions of these repositories out there.
Sure.
So I just don't know how feasible it is.
Well, it depends, right? I mean, like Google's trying to do something around this where you've got safe repos. Your premier static analysis tools or code tools will typically take a container, take it to package, pull apart, understand all these third-party dependencies, and assess those for risk. And one flag could be something like this is a verified, known good repo with a verified maintainer that they sign up for. And it's not perfect, right? You could still manipulate it. You could still corrupt it with a supply chain attack. But it's sort of that whole philosophy of some of your anti-phishing or anti-web malware tool saying, wow, this domain you're going to was just registered 5 minutes ago. That's probably a bad sign. So I just wonder if we're going to get to that stage of having to vet some of these packages for some sort of indicator of malicious activity rather than just trusting implicitly everything that's living in GitHub or NPM or wherever. And I drive that more from like I was saying earlier, a reputational hit to those environments, then I don't blame them. It's not their fault, but they're hosting it and they're serving it. And that comes with an implicit level of trust, whether deservedly or not, that may be challenged if this keeps up.
So I think on the macro scale, I think you're definitely right. For mainstream use of those libraries, absolutely. I think this kind of use case is always going to be a challenge, though, because it's people who are looking to use things that probably would never land in a trusted repository just because of the nature of the thing it is. Like, this was this was kind of a gray area, or it's not a good tool, right? It's intended to help determine whether you have amongst a large set of credentials, whether they're valid or not. So,
well, I think about what have you corrupted, like some of the many tools that are used for this sort of thing, like, John the Ripper or Hashcat or, anything in Kali, like that you're using for red teaming or auditing, that once you broke something, surreptitiously sent it to the bad guys. Ooh, that would be nasty. That's kind of what this did. Wow. Yeah. Don't do that if you're a bad guy, please. Just forget I said that.
And if you are if you're a good guy, red teamer, security analyst, just be aware of the risks. Don't get overly confident.
Maybe monitor for your outbound comms when you're running these tools.
Yeah, or that. All right. Our next story comes from Bleeping Computer. The title here is U.S. offers $5 million for info on North Korean IT worker farms.
That's a huge amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess, the average IT career is having trouble these days. So maybe this is a good, a good alternative. But we've talked in the past about this, I think 3 or 4 times. And what most notably, there was the big hoopla around KnowBe4, who published a big blog post about how they got taken by a North Korean worker. But now the U.S. government is trying to put the clamp on this, and they're asking for the public's help. And if you help them figure out, where they're at and take them down, you can, be eligible for a reward of up to $5 million, which is pretty good.
Question for you: if I start up one of these, get it going, and then turn it in, do I get the money?
That question comes up again in a couple stories, I think. But I don't know. Obviously, it's a silly question, but I don't know how, as we've talked about in the past, I don't know how a company is really able to assess whether they're accidentally hiring somebody by one of these North Korean IT employee farms, as they're called. It's by design intended to mask the actual person that you're hiring. And I don't know what the answer is. And so to me, it feels like, the most likely person to collect this bounty would be like the HR, somebody in HR of some more sophisticated company.
Well, I think the way I would approach this is as I understand it, this is a big laptop farm somewhere in the US, and the North Korean workers remote into this laptop and do their work. So if you own the hardware, right, if you insist on providing the hardware, and you have some sort of device assurance that hardware is your hardware through certificates or other means, and you control whether or not remote access software could be on there, you could prevent it that way.
And I think that in some of the reports that we read, the way they were doing it actually was by installing remote access software or turning on a remote desktop. And,
right.
And so I think in those instances, you do have a chance. And maybe maybe that's as far as the sophistication has gone, but like I could foresee them using network KVM. And if that's the case, like,
Ooh, that's ugly.
that's really hard to detect. And maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, because that's not what the actors are doing here. And in that regards, maybe the way to detect this, like you said, is it'll be some help desk or sysadmin type person looking to see, like, look at your new hires, look at the profile of the workstations your new hires are using.
So if I let my company hire one of these workers and then turn them in, do I get the money?
Well, perhaps
5 million would cover a lot of server costs.
Yeah,
Just saying.
absolutely. Perhaps it would.
But it is interesting. It is interesting. I mean, I don't mean to keep the whole thing as a joke, but it is an interesting problem. And it's interesting to me that the US is willing to pay that much money. They consider it a very serious problem, and they're very worried about this if that's the kind of reward they've got up for this.
Well, so some of the interesting things, and I made a joke about this, and it is to some extent, joke worthy. So I don't mean to. I'm not trying to be a total wet blanket. But one of the things that struck me was this only works because the people are like completely remote.
Yeah,
they're not in office ever. They're interviewed remotely. They're hired remotely. They work remotely. And they're getting jobs where they're earning up to $300,000. I'm having a hard time plugging the reality of today's IT job market, which is return to office, layoffs everywhere, declining salaries, with this, like, people in North Korea are having success in getting fully remote jobs, faking an interview and getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it I don't know. It's weird. It's
maybe you should go ask them for some tips.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where I'm at. Like, the $5 million bounty sounds interesting, but like, if you could teach a class on how people could get a job that's fully remote, making $300,000 to actual legitimate people, you might be able to make even more than 5 million.
That's fair.
So anyway, it's certainly a big concern to the U.S. government, because we have in the U.S. a hard embargo on North Korea, and there's a belief, whether it's true or not, I'm not smart enough to know, there's a belief that the money that's being paid to these employees is being funneled back to the North Korean government to fund their weapons programs. So whether that's the case or not, I don't know. That is what the government is certainly saying about it. So they're taking it seriously.
Yeah. Interesting story. Interesting new wrinkle to care about and watch for in our world. Like, I've been talking to my HR department at work, and they're like, really? We have to worry about this now? Really? I'm like, sorry.
But yeah, so if I rewind back to, so like we covered this again, we've covered this a couple of times, and I think one of the most recent ones was the KnowBe4 blog post about this.
Yep.
I guess underestimated how common this was. Like, this sounds, I'm starting to get the sense that this is a much larger problem and is happening much more commonly than I certainly gave it credit for.
Yeah. And I don't know how viable it is to tell people to do on-site interviews or fly people out to corporate and that sort of that. It seems expensive and slow, and that's not what companies want right now.
Yeah. And even there, by the way, I don't know how feasible it is, right? But like, when one of my last assignments was leading a global team. Now, this was different contexts. It was in India, right? We were hiring pretty aggressively in India, and it was a fairly common practice for people to be able to hire a proxy to basically be a stand-in, to go through the whole interview process, like even including in-person interviews.
That's wild to me.
And then like their they got paid to basically land you the job. And then like when you started the job, it wasn't the person that interviewed that actually showed up. It was, it was the actual person that hired the proxy. And so, I guess even if you're flying people out, I guess there's a way around that. That's, I guess, what my point is. And one of the concerns I have is that this is going to be yet another log on the return to office fire.
You may be right. Well,
which sucks.
Which is why we got to get our podcast empire off the ground, man.
That's right.
We need those Rogan dollars.
That's right. We're trying, man. All right. Our next story comes from techmonitor.ai, which is, I guess, the bastion of tech news. The title here is Over 600 Vulnerabilities Found in Average Software Container Study Reveals. So keeping in mind the context that this was put together by a company who services like software bills of material and software composition analysis and that sort of stuff. It is a fascinating and although not entirely surprising to me report that basically the average actively downloaded container available on like docker.io contains 604 vulnerabilities, like known vulnerabilities, not like unknown. I assume it's probably larger if you were to factor that in, but and they say that of those 604 on average, 45% are between 2 and 10 years old. And
yeah.
which is crazy. But I think it highlights the point that, and look, I have a lot of experience as of late running containers because of the infosec.exchange and all of its friends. And my observation is that a lot of especially the open source containers focus on like the application that you're using, that, whether that's like PeerTube or some application that, they'll release an update with that new, the new version of that, but they're not necessarily updating other components of the operating system, or let's say PHP or Apache or Nginx or MySQL. And so I think that's what's happening here, writ large. And in some instances, they're pointing out that 4.2% of the vulnerabilities that were rated high or critical that existed in that set of 604 were known to be actively exploited.
Yeah, that is a little bit more troubling. But a couple things I would expect. It's probably a fairly monolithic container, which means they probably haven't thinned it down to just the apps and packages to run whatever the container's purpose is. And so a lot of those might be sitting there, but aren't actually being executed. They're probably not being loaded in memory. They're probably just a bunch of packages that are just sitting there in a monolithic install of some default install that they're doing. And they're probably not updating those packages on a regular basis. So part of me questions how risky those unpatched packages truly are in a real world running example, excepting for somebody's got a foothold, they're using it for a lateral movement or privilege escalation or something like that. I've seen that a lot. I've also seen a lot of folks don't bother updating their basic containers. They load whatever the operating system is and whatever it comes with, and they never do updates except for the stuff they think they need. Also, things migrate over time or wander over time to different packages, and it's a mess. But there are better ways to handle containers. There are better ways to keep them up to date and keep them, from having this problem. But I think this is incredibly systemic. I think it's one of those things that, hey, it works, great, let's move on. These vulnerabilities stack up over time. The other thing I'd mention is of the 600 and some odd they talk about, they don't give us any criticality breakdown, at least on the summary of the report. I didn't go actually read the report. I probably should have. If 80% of these are lows, do I care about those as much?
So I think you're on a good point, and certainly where I came from, this was a topic of hot debate, especially the minimization point, because if you're consuming, let's say, a Red Hat or an Ubuntu provided container, and those are released relatively frequently, you can either take the path of maintaining all of the componentry that's in the container, or you can take the path of waiting for Ubuntu or Red Hat or whoever to release a new version. And and if you wait, sometimes, especially where you're, depending on where you're at in the life cycle of the version of the operating system that container is based on, you may or may not actually get updates for all criticality vulnerabilities. And so that can be a problem. And I think the other thing I would say is that just because you have even the 4.2% that were deemed higher critical and under active exploitation, doesn't mean that in the context of that container that it's actually exploitable. Like there could be, I'm just a stupid example, right? You could have Apache inside a container, but Apache isn't actually running in the container. And if that version of Apache is exploitable, then it shows up in that list. On the flip side, and something that you said, which I think is the right way to think about it, if you have exploitable stuff in the environment, it creates more opportunity for lateral movement or privileged escalation or what have you. And so even like, look, I think it's a hazard, right? Like it's, even if you get comfortable that nothing is exposed, it's still removing your safety net.
Sure. And I think it also exposes just a hygiene aspect.
Yeah.
There's something that is valuable, though intrinsic and difficult to articulate, of keeping your stuff up to date on a regular basis. If you had an urgent issue to come out for a patch, for instance, you're in a much more recent version, it's usually a lot less painful and disruptive, less disruptive to patch. Just having the policy and process in place to keep this stuff up to date usually is indicative of a better, more mature program from a security standpoint. Certainly there are, we come at this from a security standpoint, there are arguments to be made about, as you mentioned, maintenance costs, regression testing, disruptions, et cetera. There's always a balance here. Also, I was just kind of looking at, I went a little deeper into the report itself, and that 4% stat that they use is actually across all 16,557 identified CVEs with critical or high severity ranking that they had in their entire survey. Mm-hmm. So, which is still not great, right? But there could have been a concentration of risk in some of those. I don't know that that's the average, the way they say it. I think the article we were using maybe abstracted or sort of conflated some stats there together in a way that made it seem a little riskier than it might have been. All that being said, I'm a big proponent of keeping your containers updated on a regular basis. Don't get me wrong, including all the packages inside of it, and keep it current and keep it, honestly, there's so many ways to automate this now. You probably should just set it to a monthly patch cycle and have a nice day.
Yeah, I think that's the right way. That's the right way to go about it. Just having your containers pull in the latest dependencies, rebuild, and then redeploy on a, we were striving for every 2 weeks, but once a month would be good.
What scares me more about dependencies and containers is abandoned or dormant dependencies that are no longer being maintained. And how do you know that?
That's, it's a real problem.
Yeah. It's not like all these have an end of life policy statement published somewhere.
That's a real problem. And I think you end up having to use, if you're not actively tracking it, which, somehow, some way, you should have an understanding, some sort of situational awareness on that. Either you're tracking it manually or you're using a tool that will do it for you. I'm sure that this company that produced this report has some, flashy box that will do it for you. Or I think there's others like Aqua or whatnot that do the same thing. But, it's a good point. And, I used to say, like, whether it's in the context of a container or not, using open source is kind of like adopting a puppy. It's yours. Like, you have to take care of it. It doesn't matter if, like, the people who you gave it life are off doing something else. You are using it. It is in your yard now. You are responsible for it. And if that means that you have to be the one to fix it, then so be it. And if you can't fix it, well, then perhaps you should either find someone who can or stop using it. And I know that's probably not a super popular thing to say with the developers, but
I don't disagree. I think one of the challenges I've run into is, let's say, what do you consider a dormant or unsupported package at that point? Do you look at how long it's been since somebody did an update? What if there's no need for an update? How do I know if somebody has just abandoned this package or if some other bad actor's taken it over, which we've seen happen? There's a lot of dependencies built around these sort of third-party packages that I don't think a lot of people really think about. They're like, oh, it's fine. That's somebody else's problem. No, it's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
I've been thinking about, if nothing's been updated in 2 years, I should maybe look at a different.
Most open source. This is something that I've come to recognize as a result of running my own stuff recently, because I have that same question. Like I run, I run certain things that look like they're abandoned, and one of the cues I use. Now, this is difficult to do at scale. I'm not saying it scales at all, but it's the one I use. And that is almost all open source depends on other open source components. And so, while the application itself may not need any changes, I look to see if its dependencies have been updated.
You really need a tool of some variety to help you with that, though, because it's so complex. And not everybody runs those tools or cares about them. But I really think that it's the kind of stuff that can bite you.
Absolutely.
And also, like, there are ways to build containers that are hardened or slim that only have just the dependencies you need to run whatever it is you're trying to run. And I don't think a lot of people do that either, but you probably should.
Yeah, definitely. All right. The last story for today also comes from Ars Technica. And the title is In IT, Need Cash? Cybersecurity whistleblowers are earning big payouts. Whoa.
I have turned you in 14 times, Jerry. Not a single dollar has come my way.
So this, by the way, was becoming big news as I was leaving my prior role. The U.S. government is starting to enforce what they call the False Claims Act. And that's where you're making an assertion that something is a certain way, and it's not really that way. And it's a variant of what we've seen, the CISO of SolarWinds, being charged with, where he's purported to have made statements. I don't have any idea where the case is on that, so I'm not making any definitive statements. But the allegation was that he was making statements publicly that didn't line up with the reality behind the curtain. And so the government is really looking for the public's help in identifying cases where that's happening. And one of the subsets of people who know most are insiders. And this was the joke I was alluding to earlier. What was like one of the people that they are quoting in here was a CIO, I think, of a company. Yeah, he was the former chief information officer for Penn State University's Applied Research Laboratory. And he turned them in and got $250,000. Now, I guess the concern, I have no idea. There's absolutely no context. And so I'm not going to talk about that, talk like more hypothetically. If you're part of the problem, if you're part of the reason that problem exists, I guess I'm assuming maybe that the government is doing some kind of assessment to determine that, like, you're not creating the problem and then trying to benefit from the problem you created. I don't know.
Yeah. Did you have decision-making authority over the area being investigated?
Right.
Yeah. It reminds me a bit of, remember when the Business Software Alliance was telling everybody to turn your company in for software piracy?
Yeah.
Back in the 80s and 90s. I don't know
very,
how well that
so.
worked, but that was a similar thing. Like, if you turn your company in, get your bosses and we'll give you money. It was very much a, don't let your boss cheat hardworking people like they cheat you. Like, there's a whole bunch of class warfare kind of wrapped up in that too. And I have no idea how effective that was as a campaign, but I remember it was around for a long time. It may still be going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the BSA these days is largely a lobbying organization.
There's more money in that anyway.
I assume so. And Oracle's, I think they've patented the process of suing companies or customers for license violation. Or at least that's what it feels like.
It's just part of the customer process with Oracle now. You just expect it. In fact, you can look forward to it. And if you play it right, it can be fun, like an audit,
Yeah.
like an IRS audit. The only other thing I'll say on this is certainly I don't in any way condone anybody breaking the law, and I don't have anything against folks turning their companies in for doing bad things. Lord knows I've seen it. The only thing I will say is understand that right, wrong, or indifferent, if you get labeled as somebody who's turned your company in or sued your company, that might hurt your future prospects with other employers. They may be more hesitant to hire you. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's a fact.
So therefore, you should make sure that the reward allows you to retire. Yeah.
Bingo.
There you go.
Make it big. Show me the money.
But, I mean, look, I guess there's also instances where there's more at stake, like certainly if you're trying to report on like bad patch hygiene and you're doing it because you're frustrated, that's different than, let's say, a case where, that some healthcare organization is not properly protecting patient information or secrets to, a nuclear submarine or I don't know. Again, I don't know what the case behind this person's, I'm assuming applied research laboratory has some level of secrecy around it. So I'm going to guess there was government relevance in there, that they were entrusted with certain secrets for the government.
One of the examples that is interesting to give is somebody by the name of James Glenn sued Cisco over a video surveillance product that had known security flaws and yet was sold to numerous government agencies. There you go. Cisco eventually paid $8.6 million, of which Glenn walked away with $1 million, more than $1 million. So, I mean, that's an interesting one where, kind of reading between the lines, somebody inside was saying, hey, this has got flaws. Cisco, in theory, according to this, appeared to say, yeah, we don't care. We're not going to fix the flaws, and shipped it anyway, which in this case was found to be against the False Claims Act. And Cisco got fined a bunch of money, and the person who blew the whistle got over $1 million.
Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding, by the way, and I'm not an attorney, I don't play one on TV, but my understanding is that at least the current application of the False Claims Act is really as it pertains to an entity doing business with the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. So, like, I don't think that if your florist is hiding some dirty IT secrets that you're gonna be able to capitalize on that. I think it has to have some relevance to the U.S. government where that provider, that company, has made assertions to the government about their security which are not actually true, and that's what the False Claims Act is intending to cover. Again, I'm not a lawyer. People be happy to hear if I'm, all the ways I'm wrong, but there you have it.
But this one's kind of slippery, right? This is the same thing we've always talked about is these sort of things. I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of language in there of like, customary, due diligence, appropriate. How do you define all those things when it comes to security? What is a security flaw versus a mistake, right? And how is the program run, and what is the level of state-of-the-art of due diligence? If something ran through a static code analysis, a dynamic code analysis, and a risk review, and a threat modeling, and a peer code review, and still had a big old authentication bypass that everybody missed, is that a mistake, or is that a lack of proper due diligence that should be punished?
Well,
in this case,
yeah,
they would have to know about it and not dealt with it, and then somebody turned them in, right? So it's not exactly perfect, but it's one of those, it always scares me about when we're dealing with an adversarial situation, and this is what lawyers and case law and judges are all for, but what is the threshold of, appropriate due diligence? Or could something get really convoluted to something very low level that really wasn't a threat and assessed to not be a threat and turned into, was misunderstood and turned out to be a threat, and the company acted with, appropriate, what they thought appropriate risk management, said, nah, it's fine. And then, without and truly thought it was, and then turned out bad guys were more inventive and found some way to get around it they didn't know about. I don't know. I just think of when you're dealing with a bad actor who's trying to find ways around you and maliciously bypass you, it's always tough for me to decide what is the right level of due diligence in that case.
Yeah, in these instances, it doesn't actually require a bad actor, right? This is before it happens, and I know. So I think it was in the aftermath of the SolarWinds case, and I could be wrong on this, but President Biden's shortly thereafter signed an executive order that required the government to come up with this attestation form, and it was around secure software development. And I think there's certainly other applications of the False Claims Act, but I'm going to focus on this one because I think it's relevant to your question. That attestation requirement, and it was banging around in the government like what you exactly had to attest to for a long time, but it wasn't like you had to attest to that your software had like no vulnerabilities. You had to attest that you have a software development, this secure software development process that you consistently apply, and that process has certain attributes about it, and things like you don't release software that has known, let's say, higher critical severity vulnerabilities. Like, that's an objective thing, and it doesn't require somebody to say, or it doesn't require that to get hacked, right? It's like a statement of fact. Somebody consumes your piece of software and says, well, gosh, it's really interesting. You said that your software follows this process, which requires it to not have any higher or critical vulnerabilities when it's released. Yet, the software was released last week and it has a critical vulnerability that's 2 years old. How those two things can't coexist in the same timeline. And I think that's what they're trying to go after. And I suspect behind the curtain, it's some variation of, like, we tell the market that our software is secure, and yet I know that we're releasing products that have critical vulnerabilities, but they can't see it because it's compiled code or it's a service offering and they can't see behind the curtain or what have you.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I was probably going down the wrong.
No. I just trying to. It's a good discussion, and I don't even know if I'm on the right path.
Yeah.
This is, and by the way, it's probably all about to change. So
that's true. New administration.
So it's all about to change. A lot of this is being enforced by like the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice and whatnot, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, in terms of kind of tangential requirements. I would imagine we're gonna see a ton of change. And so all the crap that we've been talking about for the last couple of years about consternating over like breach disclosure laws and misrepresenting security, I suspect a lot of that's about to change.
Yeah, certainly. I'm not talking about the value or the political benefit or detriment, or I'm not taking a stand here, but another one that I think is vastly going to impact us was the Chevron doctrine being struck down by the Supreme Court, which gave a lot of rulemaking authority to these federal agencies that had power of law. And in essence, the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have that rulemaking authority. That's Congress who has that rulemaking authority. Those regulations and rules didn't just get wiped out of existence, but I think they could be challenged now under that lack of Chevron doctrine, if that is the appropriate term. Again, not a lawyer, not a Supreme Court expert.
It is.
And some of these could very well be found to, hey, no, you've got to go back to Congress and get Congress to pass a law before they can be forced. So it could get very interesting. And again, not stating any sort of political stance on it, just the raw reality is that probably will cause a lot of change in the next couple of years, regardless of the administration, because that doctrine was struck down.
Correct. And so yeah, I don't bring it up as any sort of a political, bit of hoopla, other than to say things are going to change. Like the way that we have been thinking about things is going to change, and it's hard to say in what ways. We don't really know. I think, if anything, like there's a bunch of hoopla going around right now with telecom providers in the US and also with like water utilities, but, specifically focusing on the telecom providers, like the government, who's been like a huge detractor of encryption, is now telling people, hey, like if you want to keep your communications private, you should definitely use encrypted messaging, because we know that we have an adversary in our telco networks, and we don't know when we'll have them out of here. And so I think that and some of the other things that have been happening, like with the public utilities, are probably going to drive some additional changes in law and prescription and whatnot. At the same time, we know that the incoming administration is very opposed to regulatory burden. And so,
Right.
like, where we end up on that, I don't know. I certainly think there's a broad recognition that, like, that is becoming bad as we continue moving forward and our world becomes much more digitized. And I hate to say it, but like, we're getting it feels like, and maybe it's just a feeling, but it feels like we're getting worse at IT, at securing IT.
Yeah.
And so the hazard that comes along with that, I think is growing.
I don't know. I don't know if I feel we're getting worse. I think the problem gets bigger because more things get online and there's more bad actors. So there's almost like a per capita sort of equation I want to run in my head. It's like, yeah, we have more vulnerabilities, but how much more against versus lines of code versus connected devices versus like there's a bunch of different metrics you could run. But
so when I say I feel like we're getting worse, it's that I feel like certain macro trends, and I'm thinking most prominently about cloud, have changed the way we think about certain fundamentals. Like, for example, there was a big news article about how 300,000, we didn't cover it today, but there's 300,000 Prometheus endpoints exposed to the internet. And there was another, just today, there was another critical firewall vulnerability. The name of the company is escaping my mind. I don't know why.
Was it Fortinet?
Fortinet. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
I kept wanting to say, anyway, it's not important. I'll get in trouble if I say somebody else. But a lot of that is because a lot of those vulnerabilities are problematic because people are exposing things in ways that they really shouldn't be. Because I feel like we've gotten away from some of the fundamentals of secure architecture and whatnot. When I pair that trend up with like everything becoming more digitized and adversaries becoming vastly more sophisticated, I just have an uneasy feeling.
Yeah, I hear you. And you're probably right. We have this innate interest in thinking everything's getting worse all the time and that we're in the worst timeline and that everything's all doom and gloom. And I try not to buy into that. Like, there's a lot of really good things that are happening and there's a lot of progress that's being made. And I think there's something in human nature and in our psychology of just sort of like feeling that we're on the edge of disaster.
There's I think you're right. There was a great book, because if you study risk, you'll eventually end up reading books from the Black Swan, and then there's another one. I forget the name of the book, but I remember the author's name is Gerd Gegenheimer. Anyway, and they're kind of at odds. Like they're polar opposites. And Gerd's book basically says people, while it might look like people are irrational in how they assess risk like that, like everybody's super negative about things, the reality is that served us throughout our evolution. Like, you didn't die if you thought you heard a tiger in the bush and you reacted accordingly, but it ended up being, like a kitten or whatever. Like, you may have lost the opportunity to pet a kitten, but you avoided getting eaten by the tiger. And so, I think we're hardwired to do that for sure. And to your point, by the way, like, we are in a, I mean, there's no doubt there's lots of stuff going wrong in the world. And I don't mean to downplay that, like, but we're kind of in an unprecedented time of peace from like on the scale of humanity. Although you would never know that. And when you watch here in the US, at least, you watch the news, you would think, oh my God, like it's just, everything is horrible. But then you realize like we're in a reasonably low period of violent crime, but you don't, like, that's not how we perceive the world. And so, yes, I admit that I'm probably buying into some of that, but that's how I feel.
No, it's fair. Was it Risk Savvy? How to Make Good Decisions?
That's the one. Nassim Taleb is the other, is the author of, going off of memory. So Nassim Taleb is the other person, and they're kind of at odds. And I think when you look at like at Daniel Kahneman and his books, about behavioral psychology, or Thinking Fast and Slow, and Richard Thaler and whatnot, they'll have, I think they're more aligned, I think, with the Black Swan way of thinking. But I think the risk savvy model is more looking at our assessment of risk as it's a feature of humanity and not like a flaw.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think for as much negative and terrible things that go on in the world, there's also, and for some reason we don't want to believe it, there's also lots of progress. Like I won't do good, and I'm sure there's probably people screaming at their podcast player right now of how terrible things are, but like there's some X accounts I like to follow that just put out posts about how things have gotten better, like literacy rates in the world, poverty rates in the world, malnutrition, child infant mortality rates, like worldwide, how things have trended better in some ways, but we never talk about it. Access to fresh water, access to electricity, access to cell phones. If you look at how far, like especially Africa as an example, and I don't know the stats off the top of my head, like Africa as a in the last 100 years in terms of like poverty and infant death and all these sorts of things have dramatically increased, but we don't look at that. We don't pat ourselves on the back and say, wow, we've made as a species progress. We just look at the next thing that's going to kill us or that we're upset about, and how that is now the new normal that we have to fix.
I think it's endemic to who we are, and there are some big problems that we have to fix.
Yeah.
Before they get too far away from us, but
I just have more hope, I guess. I feel that humans are good at innovating, and I feel like
you're more Star Trek and less Star Wars.
It depends. I think a cashless society is a terrible thing. No, I think it was funny because most people think me pretty cynical, and I am pretty cynical, but I think we have fetishized this doom worship, and people think it's cool to be. It's like, oh, we're all going to die soon is the new version of I don't own a TV. Like, you're not cooler for thinking that. You're not. There's something cool about being fatalistic in my world. Like, go find a way to solve a problem. And look, like, have a realistic view of what we're really doing and not doing. One thing that drives me crazy is some new advancement comes out, and we have a segment of the information security community that their entire purpose in life is to point out every negative thing that could come out of that advancement. AirTags is a perfect example of how they can be used to stalk people and abuse people, and they're not wrong. They're right. But if that's the only side of the argument you never hear about all the benefits and upside of something like an AirTag can do, of children who were kidnapped that were recovered, or lost stolen items that were recovered, like real world wins that balance out, or at least should be kept in consideration with the negatives. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to continue to improve. And I'm picking on AirTags because it's an example that comes to mind, but there's thousands of these. And yeah, they can be used for evil, but they can also be used for good. But if you're only focusing on all the things that are used for evil, which is what we do in our business, in our industry,
that's what we're good at.
We are good at it. And it's a lot easier to poke holes than it is. And all I'm saying is try to look at on balance what good could. There's nothing that's perfect in this world. There's never a perfect solve. There's always a downside to everything. And if you're going to be an edge case extremist about something, I'm not talking about AirTag at this point, I'm just in general, I feel like yeah, I know that'll save 5,000 people, but it's going to make 5 people's lives more difficult, so we can't do it. Like, that's just silly. But in this industry, we do that stuff all the time. And people think they're cool, and it gets them followers, and it gets them pats on the back, and the dopamine rush of, yeah, you're right on, fight the power, and here's 28 likes and 3,000 retweets and boosts, and, here's your Substack. It doesn't necessarily help always to just point out and crap all over everything. Sorry, I'm done. Put that in a short.
I, I don't have a kitten today to end the show with. He'll be back this weekend.
Aw.
My apologies.
Anyway, I had to fill some time, so there's a rant. I have rants.
Yeah. No,
Well,
look, I think opinions may differ on some things, but I think AI is always the one that I like to point out, and I think the security community is very down on AI, and there's legitimate reasons for that. But at the same time, I think that a lot, and perhaps too many of us, equate it more closely to like blockchain. We think that, blockchain was like this fad, and it was, you could look at it and say it's never going anywhere. Like, it's solving a problem that doesn't really exist. And it kind of has faded away. I mean, it's not entirely gone. Obviously, crypto coins are still, big and hot and getting bigger all the time. And I'm not trying to dispute that at all. But like a lot of the industrial and commercial use cases for blockchains, I think have kind of faded away, or at least significantly been watered down. But AI is different. I think AI is a lot more like cloud, to be perfectly honest. Like in the early days of cloud, we had the same thing. Like people were hell bent saying there's absolutely no freaking way I would ever put my stuff in a data center that I don't control.
right.
Never going to happen. It's the worst idea ever. It's terrible. It's a terrible idea. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of electricity. In the early days, you saw companies like trying to put things in the cloud that really didn't make sense. Like they were cloudifying everything.
Right.
And over time, that kind of normalized. And now certain things are like, you're starting to see stuff move out of the cloud back to data centers where it makes more economic sense. And you don't see that being marketed as a feature anymore. And I think that's where we're at with AI. Like there's a mad rush. Everybody's trying to figure out what it is. Every company on earth right now is trying to jam AI into their product because like they feel like they have to, and that's what shareholders want to see, and blah, 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 blah. And that will fade, that energy will fade away, but AI isn't going anywhere. This is not blockchain. It is here. And you can say like, it's super energy inefficient, and people aren't going to disagree, but that doesn't change the fact that companies are actively using it today productively. And there are new use cases being found like many times a day, every day, all day long, all week long, all month long. It's just here. And so I think like our job as security people are to figure out like, how do we, just like with cloud, how do we enable our companies to use it? Or we have to say, you know what? I'm so vehemently opposed to it that I'm going to move to Montana and live in a cabin. There's not a lot of like, get on the bus or not, I guess is where I'm at.
Or alternately, you just get on social media and whine.
Well, that's true. I do that a lot.
Take pictures of orchids.
Wait, I do whine a lot, don't I?
No, you don't. You don't.
Anyway, I think we can call that a show. I appreciate everybody's time and attention. Hopefully, for the two people who are left, you found this discussion useful. And definitely thank you to our Patreon donors. Love you guys and ladies. Sure. And we will talk again next week. You can again find this show and the links we talked about in all of our back episodes on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Again, if you want to donate to the podcast, it's patreon.com/defensivesec. You can follow me on infosec.exchange. It's at Jerry. And where can they find you?
You can find me on X and infosec.exchange and the same handle at Lerg, L-E-R-G.
Awesome. Have
and
a great
LinkedIn.
Oh, and LinkedIn, yes. My LinkedIn is a malicious link, so if you look that up, that actually is me and not a joke. So anyway.
Anyway, I'll let that one go.
It's not worth it.
Not worth it. No.
Not worth it. All right. Have a good one, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.